Madison stands on the windswept edge of the Charleston Bluff, watching the $1,450,000 estate she purchased glow like a jewel under the wedding lights. The humid air carries the scent of expensive lilies and calculated betrayal. My brother Tyler's voice crackles over the loudspeakers, sharp and final. This wedding is for the closest family only, and you're not on the list. I don't respond. I don't even flinch. I just look at my watch. 60 minutes. In exactly 1 hour, the legal possession handover I signed 2 weeks ago becomes absolute. Tyler thinks he's throwing me away. He doesn't realize he's just squatting in a house that already belongs to a new owner. Welcome to Turning Table Stories channel. I'm currently enjoying a quiet cup of coffee and watching the view, finding peace in this stillness. It's a moment of clarity that mirrors Madison's calm before the coming storm. Where are you joining from today, and what is your favorite drink right now? Now, let's return to the night the ledger was finally settled. I sat in the front seat of my car, the interior dark and smelling faintly of leather and cold coffee. The glow from my phone was the only light reflecting off my eyes with a surgical precision. I wasn't crying. Crying is a biological reaction to loss, and you can only lose something you actually possessed. I had never possessed their love. I had only been a silent investor in their version of family, a bank account they drew from until the balance hit zero. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight I was finally closing the account. I opened the email from the escrow company. The subject line was clear: sale confirmed. Transfer of ownership complete. The property at 114 Maple Crest Drive was no longer mine. It had been sold 2 weeks ago to a high-end investment fund that didn't care about bloodlines or wedding vows. They only cared about the return on their $1,450,000 investment. This wasn't a breakdown. I had negotiated a fire sale price with one non-negotiable clause: immediate vacant possession. To this fund, my family wasn't a group of people. They were encumbrances on a balance sheet. They didn't care about the wedding. They cared about the $50,000 a day penalty if the renovation crew was delayed even an hour past the 8 a.m. start time tomorrow. It was a balance sheet. Tyler thinks he has time. He sent me a text yesterday, hidden between his wedding rants, asking for a grace period. We need a few more days to move the gifts. Madison, be a sister for once. He thinks my heart is a contract that can be amended with a few words of guilt. But my heart isn't a contract. It's a closed file. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. 7:00 p.m. The official possession date deadline just passed. Tyler is currently inside giving a toast in a ballroom that legally doesn't belong to him. He's celebrating a union built on the floor of a house that he's essentially trespassing in. The air in the car grew colder as the heater ticked down. I thought about the many times I'd sat in this same car, looking at that house, wondering if I'd ever be invited through the front door as a guest instead of a benefactor. Every dollar I'd poured into those walls, every nail, every coat of paint, it was all a bid for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I'd been subsidizing my own exclusion for years. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I pulled up a message to the buyer's lead attorney. My thumb didn't tremble. I typed with the same focus I used to finalize a multi-million-dollar structural blueprint. It is 7:00. The property is vacant by law, even if it is physically occupied. I am formally requesting that your security team and the new property management take possession at exactly 7:15 p.m. Do not grant an extension, not for a day, not for an hour, not for a single second. I hit send. The blue line moved across the screen, a digital guillotine dropping on the life Tyler had carefully stolen from me. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I was simply balancing a ledger that had been in the red for 17 years. Outside, the wedding lights continued to twinkle. The string quartet was probably playing something classical and romantic. In 15 minutes, that music is going to stop. I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the second hand on my watch sweep around the dial. Tick, tick, tick. The final hour of possession was over. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest, letting the silence of the car swallow me. 17 years. That's how long I've been building this foundation, not out of stone or wood, but out of the sheer, jagged debris of my own survival. Everyone thinks I'm cold. They think I'm transactional. They don't understand that when you're raised as a spare part in your own home, you learn that every emotion has a cost and every act of kindness is a debt waiting to be collected. My mother, Sarah, was the only person in that house who understood the concept of fairness. When she died on that gray Tuesday in October, the light in our lives didn't just dim, it was extinguished. I was 14, still a child who believed that if I worked hard and stayed quiet, my father would eventually see me. But Charles never saw me. He only saw Tyler. Tyler was anointed the man of the house at 16, while I was relegated to an obligation Sarah had left behind. The real betrayal didn't happen at a crowded dinner table. It happened in a sterile bank office. My mother had set up a trust for my education, $120,000, intended to give me the future she knew Charles wouldn't provide. But the ink on her death certificate was barely dry before my father found a legal loophole to siphon it off. He didn't use it for the house or to keep us afloat. He dumped it all into one of Tyler's revolutionary tech startups, a venture that collapsed within 8 months. My future was traded for Tyler's latest whim, and nobody even asked if I was okay with being bankrupted at 15. I didn't break because survivors don't have that luxury. I worked 3 jobs while my peers were at prom. I scrubbed floors in the morning, hauled coffee during my lunch breaks, and sat in the back of the university library until 2 a.m. studying architectural structural loads. I lived in a room that smelled like laundry detergent and desperation because I refused to ask Charles for a single cent. I bought this waterfront land not to show off, but because it was the last piece of my mother's heritage, a legacy Charles had sold off to a stranger for pennies on the dollar years ago just to clear Tyler's mounting gambling debts. People often ask why I stayed silent for so long, why I let them treat me like an uninvited guest while I was the one secretly keeping the lights on. It's what I call the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up in a house where your worth is measured only by how useful you are to someone else, silence becomes your primary armor. You don't scream because screaming invites attention you can't afford. You don't fight back because you're waiting. I wasn't being weak. I was being strategic. I was waiting for the moment I was finally heavy enough to tip the scale. I was a ghost in their house, but ghosts have one advantage. We see everything, and we never forget a debt. Tonight, the useful daughter is gone. I'm finally reclaiming the space they tried to erase me from. Tyler didn't just stop at a verbal insult at the gate. He wanted to perform a full-scale character assassination. I opened the private digital wedding portal on my phone, the exclusive app Abigail's family used to coordinate with their high society guests, my breath hitching as the page loaded. There, it was a glowing feature on the wedding of the year. The lead image showed Tyler and Abigail standing on the wraparound porch I had spent 6 months renovating, looking like royalty. The caption was a masterpiece of fiction. Tyler was quoted as saying, "The $1,450,000 estate was a poignant legacy, a final gift from our late mother, Sarah, to ensure her favorite son would always have a place of honor." He had turned my hard-earned architectural success into a fairy tale where he was the beloved protagonist, and I didn't even merit a mention. But then I saw the section that made my blood turn to ice. A bold notification on the guest information page served as a warning about a distant and unstable relative who had been making troubling claims about the property. He told 200 of Charleston's most powerful people that I was mentally ill. He used my mother's death, the very event that had shattered me, as a justification for my supposed breakdown. He told them I had never recovered and was obsessed with a past that never existed. It was a lethal erasure. He wasn't just squatting in my house. He was stealing the very foundation of who I was. He was using the money I earned in the home I designed to tell a world of strangers that I was a phantom they should avoid. He had flipped the narrative, turning the person who gave everything into a person who was a danger to their perfect image. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. This was the ultimate social erasure he had been planning for months. He needed Abigail's elite family to see him as a man of substance, and since he had no substance of his own, he simply cannibalized mine. He wore my success like a rented tuxedo, hoping no one would see the frayed seams of his lies. I sat in the front seat, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes like a surgical laser. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. He thought his lies were an ironclad contract. He thought that by calling me unstable, he had invalidated any truth I could ever tell. He was wrong. They weren't shocked by what they'd done, they were just comfortable because I had always played the role of the silent investor in their version of family. They mistook my silence for submission and my loyalty for a blank check. Tyler thought he had murdered my reputation to secure his future. He didn't realize he had just handed me the final evidence I needed for a total liquidation. I looked at the clock. 7:10 p.m. In 5 minutes, the unstable relative was going to become the most real thing in his life. I didn't stay in the car long. I drove 3 blocks to a darkened overlook where a familiar black sedan was idling. Laura Callahan was waiting, my godmother, my mother's best friend, and one of the most feared estate lawyers in South Carolina. She was the sentinel who had been standing on the perimeter of my life for 17 years, watching the fire from a distance, waiting for me to signal for help. She handed me a thick, manila envelope, the Sarah file. Inside were documents Sarah had signed in the final weeks of her life, witnessed and sealed by Laura. "I've carried this regret like a stone in my pocket, Madison," Laura said, her voice like sandpaper on silk. "Every time I saw Tyler in a new car you paid for, or Charles siphoning your spirit, I wanted to burn their world down. But I promised your mother I'd wait. She knew you had to be the one to decide when enough was enough. She knew you needed to be the architect of your own rescue. I didn't just watch Madison. I spent those 17 years quietly filing injunctions and blocking Charles from siphoning the last of your mother's residual assets. I was your invisible legal shield, holding the perimeter until you were strong enough to pick up the sword yourself." This was the silent regret of the Sentinel. Laura hadn't been indifferent. She had been a failsafe. Sarah knew Charles and Tyler would treat my loyalty like a natural resource to be strip-mined. She had positioned Laura to be the one to hand me the explosives when I was finally ready to use them. Charles thinks 17 years of silence made him safe. He forgot about the discovery rule. In the eyes of the law, the clock on this fraud didn't start in 2009. It started the moment I opened this envelope and discovered the knife he left in my back. Because I was a minor when he siphoned my trust, the law had been patiently waiting for me to wake up and claim my justice. At 7:15 p.m., the headlights of 2 white SUVs cut through the evening fog, followed by a local sheriff's cruiser. This was the professional escalation. The investment fund I sold the house to didn't care about family dynamics. They wanted their property. I followed them at a distance as they pulled into the long, gravel driveway. The sound of the gravel crunching under tires was the only warning. The security team didn't use the back door. They marched right through the front foyer, past the towering floral arrangements and the stunned string quartet. Tyler was at the microphone, likely mid-sentence, in another lie about his mother's legacy. He stopped. The music died, a messy, dissonant death. A sheriff's deputy stepped onto the raised platform, holding a court-ordered writ of possession. I stood in the shadows of the oaks, watching the scene through the open French doors. The 200 guests were frozen, their champagne glasses suspended in midair like props in a museum. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a property management enforcement. Tyler looked at the deputy, then at the elite security team in their tailored dark suits, men who looked more like high-level federal agents than mere guards. He started to shout his face, turning that familiar, entitled shade of red, but the deputy didn't flinch. He didn't care about the name Ashford or the $750,000 budget. He simply pointed to the door. Possession had ended. The event of the decade had just become a mass eviction. I walked through the open French doors, the hem of my coat brushing against the scattered rose petals on the floor. I didn't rush. I didn't hide. I moved with the heavy, unyielding pace of a structural support beam. 200 faces turned toward me, some curious, some horrified, some already filming on their phones. I could see my father, Charles, standing near the bar, his face the color of old parchment. Tyler was still on the stage, his hands gripping the mahogany podium as if it were the only thing keeping him from sinking into the ground. "Madison, get out!" Tyler's voice cracked, echoing through the silent ballroom. "I told everyone you weren't well. Security, remove her." But the security team didn't move. They were standing behind the sheriff's deputy, and they knew exactly who I was. I didn't yell back. I didn't need to. I reached into the manila envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a high-resolution scan of my mother's final trust authorization. "You told these people this house was a poignant legacy from our mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stillness. "You told them I was an unstable relative, obsessed with a past that never existed. But the only thing that doesn't exist, Tyler, is the foundation of your lies." I walked toward the stage and laid the paper on the edge for everyone in the front row to see. This was the kill shot. The Serifile didn't just contain sentimental letters, it contained a forensic audit Laura had been building for nearly 2 decades. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the document dated 17 years ago. 17 years ago, Charles forged my mother's signature to withdraw $120,000 from my education trust. He didn't use it to save our home. He used it to fund Tyler's first failed business while I was walking miles in the dark to make scholarship interviews. The murmur that went through the room was like a physical wave. Abigail's father, a man who built his empire on integrity, stepped forward to look at the paper. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who had finally seen the missing piece of a puzzle. He had suspected Tyler was a hollow counterfeit for months, and now he finally held the forensic proof of the rot beneath the tuxedo. I pulled out a second document, the original land deed Charles had sold to cover Tyler's gambling debts. This house Tyler is standing in, I bought it back with my own money, through my own firm, to honor a mother you both tried to erase. It wasn't a gift, it was a recovery. I looked directly at Tyler, who looked like a ghost haunting his own party. "Legally, this isn't a wedding reception anymore," I said, my voice clinical and factual. "This is an active investigation into 17 years of systematic financial fraud. The signatures on the documents you used to secure your social standing are fake. The story you told your bride is fake. And the roof over your head, it's already been sold to cover the debts you didn't even know you had. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply performing a final audit." The shadow daughter was finally bringing everything into the light. The room stayed frozen, the silence so dense I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Margaret Ashford, a woman whose lineage was built on 3 centuries of rigid Charleston honor, didn't scream. She simply turned her gaze from the forensic audit in her hands to the man standing on the stage. It was the look of an expert appraiser discovering a crude counterfeit. "Stop the music," she said, her voice quiet but lethal. The string quartet, which had been attempting a frantic recovery, finally went dead. Abigail stood at the center of the ballroom, her white silk veil fluttering in the draft from the open French doors. She looked at the man she had just sworn her life to and realized she was standing next to a phantom. Tyler tried to reach for her arm, but his hands were shaking so violently he looked like a frightened child. His face was no longer that of a confident tech consultant. It was a mask of gray, sweaty panic. I watched him and realized I was witnessing the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Tyler had spent years believing that as long as he stood inside my walls and spent my mother's stolen legacy, he was a king. He mistook the balance in my bank account for the strength of his own character. But power that is borrowed is never truly owned. The moment I pulled the financial floor from beneath him, he didn't just lose a house, he lost his entire identity. He was a hollow shell, a rented persona whose lease had just been terminated. "Abigail, please." Tyler stammered, his voice thin and reedy. She's lying. She's unstable. Remember? I told you she was obsessed. Abigail didn't answer. She looked at the sheriff's deputy, then at the forged documents, and finally at me. The realization in her eyes was a slow-motion collapse. She reached up, unhooked the veil from her hair, and let it fall to the rose-covered floor. Then she twisted the engagement ring off her finger, the one Tyler had likely bought with credit he couldn't pay back, and dropped it onto the mahogany podium. It hit the wood with a sharp, final click. She walked past him without a word, her mother and bridesmaids trailing behind her like a silent funeral procession. Tyler sank to his knees on the stage. He looked up at me, his eyes red and pleading. Madison, why? We're family. You're destroying me in front of everyone. I looked down at him, my heart feeling like a cold, balanced ledger. You wanted a wedding for the closest family only. Tyler, I said, my voice echoing through the emptying hall. Congratulations. You finally got exactly what you asked for. Now you only have yourself. I turned and walked out the front door, my boots clicking against the hardwood I had paid for. Behind me, the 200 guests were filing out in a hum of horrified whispers. My father was nowhere to be seen, likely already looking for a back exit to hide his shame. I didn't look back. I was 31 years old. I had just reclaimed my mother's legacy, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's spare part. I was the architect of my own peace. The hum of the crowd at the estate has faded into a distant memory, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the tides against the Charleston bluff. The fallout for Tyler and Charles was swift and irreversible. The authorities have opened formal investigations into the financial fraud and forgery that started 17 years ago. Tyler, stripped of the social status my money provided, is no longer the rising tech consultant. He is a cautionary tale in Charleston's most exclusive circles. Charles has finally lost the only thing he truly valued more than his children, his reputation. I used a significant portion of the $1,450,000 from the sale of the house to close the circle my mother started. I established the Sarah Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the inheritance and trust rights of children who have lost their parents. It provides the legal shield I never had when my father was siphoning my future to fund Tyler's failures. I didn't just want to reclaim my life. I wanted to ensure no other 14-year-old girl has to walk miles in the dark because her foundation was stolen by the people meant to protect her. The house on Maplecrest Drive belongs to the Brennan family now. They repainted the front door red, a color of warmth and new beginnings, not the cold luxury Tyler used as a weapon. I bought a smaller place for myself, a sanctuary where every corner reflects the peace I've finally earned. I am no longer a spare part in someone else's version of family. I am the architect of my own world. Looking back on this journey, I've come to realize that I spent 31 years trying to buy a chair at a table where I was never welcome. I thought if I gave enough silence, enough money, and enough patience, they would eventually see me, but I was wrong. If they don't want you at the table, don't keep trying to buy it. Sell the house, walk away, and build your own home. I've learned that setting a boundary isn't an act of cruelty, it's an act of survival. You don't need their permission to stop being a bank account for their neglect. Forgiveness isn't always about letting people back in. Sometimes it's just the final signature on a contract that has been in the red for too long. It's the only way to set yourself free. If you find yourself in a similar situation where your loyalty is treated like a resource to be mined, remember that your worth isn't a balance sheet for others to overdraw. You are enough, exactly as you are, and you deserve a seat at a table where you don't have to pay for the privilege of belonging. If you've ever had to choose between a toxic family and your own self-respect, share your story down in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and remember, you are the architect of your own peace.